man who always answered the call to public service, it seems appropriate that Frederick Andrew Seaton began his life in Washington, D.C. The year was 1910. His father, Fay Seaton, was serving as secretary to U.S. Senator Joseph Bristow of Kansas. Fred Seaton attended schools in the nation's capital, but it soon became apparent that much of his education was taking place in a home where service to the community was a part of each day. When the time came to select a college, Fred Seaton chose to return to the Midwest, to Kansas State College. There, he began to prepare to enter the family business, studying to become a newspaper man. It was at Kansas State that he met fellow journalism student Gladys Dowd. In 1931, his college education complete, Fred and Gladys married. The young journalist became telegraph editor of the Manhattan Mercury newspaper and spent the next 6 years in various capacities on the Seaton Daily newspapers in Manhattan, Kansas. Along with his father and brother Richard, Fred Seaton purchased the Hastings Tribune in 1937. Fred moved from Manhattan to Hastings to become publisher of the Tribune. It would become a home to which he would return many times. During the previous year, another watershed event had occurred in the life of Fred Seaton. His involvement in the 1936 presidential bid of Kansas Governor Alf Landon marked the beginning of Fred's long and varied political career, a career that would ultimately span nearly 4 decades. Meanwhile, Seaton's business career continued to soar. In 1940, the Nebraska Broadcasting Company, of which Seaton was president, signed KHAS Radio onto the airwaves. With 250 watts of power, the news station broadcast from Seaton's own Tribune building, itself purchased only a year earlier. Throughout the 1940s, the political star of Fred Seaton was rising. In 1945 and 1947, the Hastings businessman served 2 terms in the Nebraska Unicameral. When U.S. Senator Kenneth Wherry died in office in 1951, Governor Val Peterson turned to Fred to fill out the unexpired term, calling him a man with the necessary business training to effectively fight against government waste. In 1952, Seaton returned to his home in Hastings, but it wasn't long before he felt the tug of duty once again. Fred found himself taking an active role in the effort to persuade General Dwight Eisenhower to stump for the Republican presidential nomination. Seaton made a trip to Paris, where the general was serving as NATO commander, to make a personal appeal to Ike. After the war hero agreed to run, Seaton took on duties as a presidential campaign advisor. Mutual respect between the two men brought Fred back to Washington following Eisenhower's election, first as Assistant Secretary of Defense. During his tenure, Fred won the Medal of Freedom, the highest award any civilian employee of the government can receive. Following his success at the Pentagon, Seaton was made an administrative assistant and then deputy assistant to the president. In 1956, President Eisenhower named Fred Seaton the nation's 37th Secretary of the Interior, making him only the 3rd Nebraskan in history to hold a cabinet position. It turned out to be one of Fred's finest hours, showing his vision, energy, and foresight. As Interior Secretary, Seaton is given most of the credit for bringing Hawaii and Alaska into the Union. He also was the first cabinet member to receive a Joint Distinguished Service Conservation Award, presented by 15 of the nation's foremost conservation groups. The award cited Fred's courageous service rendered in the conservation and management of the country's natural resources. By 1955, Fred Seaton had reached the point in his public service career where he found himself mentioned as a possible Republican candidate for president. His name stayed on the minds of many prominent Republicans, and he was suggested as a potential running mate for Richard Nixon in 1960. Throughout this busy period of public service, Fred Seaton also reached new heights in his business career. On January 1st, 1956, KHAS-TV signed on for the first time. The new television station was an enormous investment of both money and energy. The early studio cameras cost $16,000 each, and most shows were aired live from the local studio, including news, children's programming, and even cooking shows. The visionary in Fred made KHAS-TV an innovator over the years. Thanks in part to Seaton, the station became one of the first in the region to acquire color equipment in 1967. To this day, KHAS-TV remains a Seaton family-owned station and continues its 40-year affiliation with the NBC network. Within professional journalism circles, Fred was recognized as an outstanding member of the news fraternity. He was a member of the Associated Press Board of Directors, served as president of the Nebraska Associated Press, and became only the second person ever to receive a Master Publisher Editor Award from the Nebraska Press Association. Throughout the remainder of his life, Fred Seaton stayed active in public service. He served as a member of the Republican National Committee, was chairman of Radio Free Europe, and a board member for the National Trust for Historic Preservation, among many other positions. In 1971, President Richard Nixon appointed Seaton to the chairmanship of the President's Advisory Panel on Timber and the Environment, which turned out to be Fred's last act of public service. On January 16, 1974, the life that began 64 years earlier in Washington, D.C., ended in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Frederick Andrew Seaton left behind a legacy of vision, energy, and dedication. It was a life of accomplishment, success, and service to his country and community.